The door shattered inward. Gunfire lit the darkness. And in the far corner of that shack, a 22-year-old girl from Philadelphia who had never held a weapon in her life turned her back to the bullets, wrapped herself around a newborn baby, and did not make a sound. That girl would bring an entire town to its knees. But first, let me tell you how she got there. They called it a joke. The men of power in Bitter Creek thought themselves mighty clever. Mayor Harlan Briggs, with his gold-capped teeth and hands that had never known a single callus, decided to send a mail-order bride to a dead man. Not just any dead man. Phineas Crane, a merchant whose body had been found behind his own counter with 2 bullets in his chest and the safe cleaned out. Briggs knew Crane was dead. He had arranged the knowing of it. But the letter had already gone east, and the girl had already answered, and Briggs thought, let her come. Let her ride 2,000 miles across prairie and mountain for a ghost. Let her arrive at nothing. Let the wilderness swallow her, along with whatever secrets Crane may have whispered into her trusting ears. He laughed when the stagecoach left the rail station that September morning. He poured himself a whiskey in his office above the saloon, and he laughed, and the sound of it was the kind of sound that makes decent men look away. He expected her to die somewhere on the Wyoming flats, alone, forgotten. But Harlan Briggs did not know about the Hawthorne brothers, and he certainly did not know about Emmeline Grace Whitmore. Sometimes the stone you throw away turns out to be the diamond you were looking for. Now, folks, if you love these frontier tales, do me a quick favor and hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this story with more people who need it. And trust me, you are going to want to stay for this one. Because what happened on a frozen Wyoming evening in the autumn of 1879 is the kind of story that stays with a man long after the fire burns down. Now, let me tell you how it began. The wind came down from the high country that evening, cold and restless, dragging dust across the plains like a wandering spirit with nowhere to settle. The sun was sinking behind the broken spine of the Wyoming mountains, bleeding red across a sky too wide for any man to claim. It was the kind of dusk that made a rider feel small beneath the gaze of the Almighty. The kind that whispered, you are nothing out here. The land does not care about your name, your grief, or how many winters you have survived. It will bury you the same as it buried everyone who came before. Caleb Hawthorne rode at the head of the line. His bay gelding moved slow after 3 weeks in the saddle, each hoofbeat steady and tired against the hardened earth. Behind him, his brother Josiah rode in the middle, both sides of his saddle heavy with game. Deer, rabbit, beaver pelts bundled tight, the fruits of 21 days in the deep timber. And behind Josiah, bringing up the rear with a rifle across his lap and eyes that never stopped scanning the horizon, rode Wyatt, the youngest, the loudest, the one most likely to start a fight in a saloon and least likely to apologize for finishing it. 3 brothers. 3 men that Wyoming had shaped from Virginia boys into something harder, quieter, and more dangerous than anything civilization had intended. They did not speak. They had not spoken more than 50 words between them since breaking camp that morning. That was the way of the Hawthorns. After 9 years together on these mountains, they communicated through gesture, glance, and silence. Caleb raised a fist. Both brothers stopped. Josiah nudged his horse left. Wyatt drifted right, no questions asked. They moved like a single creature with 6 legs and 3 rifles. I want you to picture Caleb carefully because understanding this man is the key to understanding everything that follows. He was not yet 40, though his face carried the carved lines of a man who had seen 60 years of living, pressed into half that number. Tall, 6 feet and 6 inches of sun-browned muscle built by labor, not vanity. Shoulders broad enough to carry timber. hands so calloused that the skin had turned the color of old saddle leather, a jaw like a cliff face covered in 3 days of dark stubble, eyes the color of whiskey, held up to firelight, and just as capable of burning. The war had taken his youth. He had walked into the Union Army at 20 years old in 1861, a boy from the Shenandoah Valley who believed in something. He walked out 4 years later, believing in nothing but the weight of a rifle and the distance between himself and other human beings. He had killed 14 boys at Coal Creek Bridge in the January of 1864. Boys, 16, 17 years old, wearing gray uniforms, too big for their shoulders, charging across a frozen creek because someone who would never hold a rifle told them to. Caleb held the high ground. Caleb did not miss. One of those boys had screamed a name as he fell, over and over. A brother's name called out into the Virginia winter like a prayer that would never be answered. Caleb still heard it every night. 9 years later, on the other side of the continent, lying in a cabin so far from civilization that the nearest neighbor was 40 miles of mountain trail away, he still heard that boy screaming for his brother. But that was not the deepest wound, not even close. After the war, Caleb married Anna, sweet Anna with her loud laugh and her flour-dusted hands and her stubborn refusal to ever back down from anything. He married her when he was 25 in a small church in Virginia with wildflowers in her hair. And for 3 years, Caleb Hawthorne knew what it was to be happy. Then Anna got pregnant, and on a March night in 1870, in a cabin that smelled of pine smoke and iron, Caleb delivered his own son into the world. The midwife came too late. The bleeding would not stop. Caleb held Anna's hand and watched the light leave her eyes the way a candle gutters in a draft. Slow, then sudden, then gone. The baby lived 9 hours, just long enough for Caleb to hold him, to feel the impossible smallness of those fingers, to whisper a name that would never be spoken again. He buried them both the next morning, side by side, under a dogwood tree that Anna had loved because it bloomed white every April. Then he closed the door of that house. He collected his 2 younger brothers, Josiah, 25, and Wyatt, 21, and he said, "We are going west. There is nothing left here." Josiah asked how far west. Caleb answered, "Until I cannot hear her voice anymore." 9 years later, on a Wyoming evening painted in blood-red light, Caleb Hawthorne still heard her. But up on these mountains, at least the wind was loud enough to cover it. He took a sip of bitter coffee from his tin canteen. His hand trembled, not from fear, from the memory of last winter. The fever had taken him in January when Josiah and Wyatt were 3 days south trading pelts in Cheyenne. 10 days Caleb lay on the cabin floor, burning and freezing by turns, watching the firelight dance on the ceiling, and wondering if this was how it ended. Not in battle, not in a blizzard, just a man alone in a room with nobody coming and nobody knowing and nobody to close his eyes when they finally stopped seeing. He survived, by the grace of God, in a body made of iron. But the morning he managed to stand, he caught his reflection in the creek water and saw an old man staring back. His knees popped when he stood up now. He did not comment on it anymore. He could not do another winter alone, but he did not know how to change the only life he understood. The wind shifted. Caleb heard it before his brothers did. A sound so thin it was almost nothing, carried between gusts, swallowed by the open land, then returned. Like the earth itself was trying to tell him something. Not a coyote, not a fox, human. A woman's voice stretched tight with pain. Caleb pulled the reins. The gelding stopped and lifted its head, ears pricking forward. Behind him, Josiah's horse did the same. Even Wyatt's Mustang, a creature as temperamental as its rider, went still. They listened. The wind pushed hard from the northwest, cold and sharp with the smell of coming snow. And beneath it, threaded through the silence like a needle through cloth, the cry came again. Josiah spoke first. "That is no animal." Wyatt's hand went to his revolver. "Could be a trap." Comanche used crying sounds to draw soldiers out of cover in the old days. Caleb said nothing. He swung down from the saddle boots hitting packed earth and began walking toward the line of cottonwood trees that marked a creek bed a short distance off. The sound had come from there. What he did not know, and what I need you to understand, is that Caleb Hawthorne was walking toward the single event that would tear open every scar he carried and force him to choose between the safety of his solitude and the terrifying possibility of feeling something again. She did not know it yet, but a few weeks from this moment, Emmeline Grace Whitmore would ride into frozen mountains to save a man twice her size with nothing but a needle, a poultice, and the kind of stubborn courage that no blizzard could break. The creek bed dipped low and offered slight shelter from the wind. Cottonwood trunks rose pale in the fading light, their bare branches scratching the darkening sky like fingers reaching for something they could never hold. And there, beside a wagon tilted at a broken angle near the trees, Caleb found them. Two women. The wagon was ruined. One wheel buried axle deep in mud. The main beam had split clean through the wood, splintered white where it snapped. A mule lay on his side 20 paces away, stiff and cold, its neck bent at an angle that told the story without words. Beside the wagon, scattered in the mud and brown grass, lay the contents of two small lives. A carpet bag with its mouth open, a shawl, a tin pot, and a book with a green cover face down in the dirt. The first woman knelt in the shelter of the wagon's tilted side. Young. So young it stopped Caleb's breath for a half second. She could not have been more than 22 summers. She wore a deep crimson red dress, the kind a city woman might wear to travel in. The bodice fitted the skirt full, the fabric rich even under layers of dust and something darker. Blood. A stain spreading from her left side where she pressed a wadded cloth against her hip with one hand. Her other hand held a small knife, the blade no longer than a finger, pointed directly at Caleb's chest. Her face was pale as paper. Honey blonde hair stuck to her temples with sweat. But her eyes, Lord, her eyes were something else. Cornflower blue, bright and fierce and absolutely, completely awake. Not the eyes of a woman waiting to be saved. The eyes of a woman who had been saving herself all day and was not about to stop now. "Stay back," she said. Behind her, half hidden in shadow, lay the second woman. Younger still, 19 at most, with dark hair matted to a face flushed deep red. Her belly swelled beneath a threadbare dress tight as a drum, and her body convulsed as a contraction ripped through her. The scream that came from her was the sound Caleb had heard from the ridge. Raw, animal, the sound of a body being torn open by the oldest force on earth. Caleb stopped. He removed his hat, held it against his chest. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, the way he spoke to spooked horses. "My name is Caleb Hawthorne. These are my brothers, Josiah and Wyatt. We heard your friends' cries from the ridge up yonder. We mean no harm." The woman with the knife studied him, studied Josiah, who had appeared at Caleb's shoulder with his hands raised, palms out, studied Wyatt, who stood at the tree line with both revolvers drawn, scanning the darkness behind them, not even looking at the women, because his job was to watch for whatever had put them here. Another contraction seized the pregnant woman, and she folded inward with a cry that seemed to rip free from the center of her being. The blonde woman's eyes flickered. Just for a moment, the fortress of her composure cracked, and Caleb saw what was underneath: exhaustion, terror, the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been fighting alone for too long. "Please," she whispered, and the knife lowered. "Please do not leave us." Josiah stepped forward, slowly the way a man approaches a wounded deer. "I know something about medicine, miss. I am not a doctor, but I have tended wounds and fevers on this frontier for years. Let me help." The woman looked into Josiah's eyes. Something in them, the warmth, the steadiness, the absolute absence of threat, made her decide. She dropped the knife into the dirt. "She has been like this since morning," she said, and her voice was clear despite everything. Controlled. The voice of a woman accustomed to bearing things silently. "All day, lone. I did not know what to do." "And you, Josiah said, his gaze falling to the bloody cloth at her hip. "What happened to you?" "Bandits," she said. "3 of them. They attacked our wagon at dawn, killed our driver. I fought one off." A pause, the ghost of something hard crossed her face. "I stabbed him in the arm with my father's letter knife. He cut me before he fell off the wagon. I drove the mule hard, but the axle broke coming down the slope. The mule snapped its leg and died." She swallowed. "Since then, we have been here." Caleb looked at the broken wagon, at the dead mule, at the scattered belongings of 2 women who had been traveling through the most unforgiving landscape in America with nothing but a knife the size of a finger and whatever courage God gave them. "What is your name?" he asked. "Emmeline," she said. "Emmeline Whitmore. And this is Retta Porter. Her husband died of fever in Missouri 3 months ago. We were traveling together to Oregon." Wyatt's voice came sharp from the tree line. "If bandits hit them at dawn, they could be close. I found tracks heading north. 3 riders. They will circle back by morning." Caleb knelt beside Retta. The young widow's eyes were glazed with pain, her fingers gripping the wagon frame until her knuckles went white. He had seen this before. He had seen this exactly once before in a cabin far east of here, in a life that had burned away like morning fog. "How far along?" he asked Emmeline. 9 months. She was due any day. The journey, the attack, it must have started the labor. Josiah was already rolling his sleeves up, already pulling supplies from his saddlebag, clean cloth, a flask of whiskey for disinfecting dried yarrow packed in a leather pouch. He checked Retta with quick, competent hands. Then he looked at Caleb, and the look on his face said everything. "She is close, Caleb, very close. I have never delivered a baby, but you have." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Caleb did not move. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, he was not in a creek bed in Wyoming. He was in a cabin in Virginia. March 1870. Blood on his hands. Anna's face going white. The sound that haunted him worse than Cold Creek Bridge. Worse than anything the war had thrown at him. The silence after his son stopped breathing. Emmeline Whitmore saw it happen. She did not know what caused it, not yet. But she saw this enormous man, this mountain of leather and muscle and quiet authority freeze in place as if something inside him had cracked. And she did the bravest thing Caleb Hawthorne had ever witnessed. She looked him straight in the eye, this girl half his size and half his age, bleeding from her own wound, kneeling in the dirt beside her dying friend. And she said, "Mr. Hawthorne, she is dying. Whatever happened before, it is not happening now. Come back to us." Her voice cut through the fog like a blade. Blue eyes met amber. And Caleb Hawthorne, who had not let another human being tell him what to do in 9 years, came back. He rolled his sleeves, he steadied his hands. "Josiah, hold her steady. Miss Whitmore, I need you beside me. When the pain comes, you tell her to breathe deep. When her body tells her to push, she pushes. I will do the rest." And so on a frozen Wyoming evening, under a sky turning from red to violet, beside a broken wagon in a creek bed where cottonwood trees stood watch like silent witnesses, Caleb Hawthorne delivered a child into the world for the second time in his life. Retta bore down with the strength born from fear and stubborn will. Emmeline held her hand, wiped her brow, murmured words that were half prayer and half command. "You are the bravest woman I know, Retta. One more. Just one more." She was injured. She was exhausted. She had been alone all day with her friends' screams and a dead mule and the knowledge that the men who attacked them might return at any moment. But she did not falter. She was there, fully, completely there, and Caleb noticed. Wyatt stood at the perimeter, back turned, rifle ready, eyes on the darkening plains. Every few minutes he glanced over his shoulder, and each time the look on his face shifted a little further from suspicion towards something he did not have a name for yet. Then Caleb saw it, a crown of dark hair slick and wet in the firelight. "I see the baby," he said. His voice was rough, not with effort, with something older, something that reached back across 9 years and grabbed hold of his chest and squeezed. He had said these exact words before, in that Virginia cabin, and after those words there had been silence. But not this time. "One more push, Retta. Give it everything." Retta gathered what remained of her strength and gave it all. The child slipped into Caleb's trembling hands, small, fragile, impossibly warm. For a heartbeat silence. Then the baby cried, sharp, clear, alive. Caleb Hawthorne looked down at the newborn girl in his hands, and a single tear, just one, tracked down his weathered face and disappeared into his stubble. He had not cried since 1870. He had believed he no longer could. "It is a girl," he said. Emmeline took the baby from his hands with a tenderness that made Josiah look away. She wrapped the child in a fur-lined coat from Josiah's pack and placed her gently against Retta's chest. Mother and child skin to skin, breathing together for the first time. "Is she whole?" Retta whispered. "Is she alive?" "She is perfect," Emmeline said, and smiled. And the smile was so full of heartbreak and hope at the same time that Caleb had to stand up and walk 3 paces away and look at the stars until his eyes stopped burning. But the moment did not last. It never does. Josiah saw it first. His face changed, the warmth dropping away, replaced by something clinical and urgent. "Caleb," his voice was low, just loud enough. "Too much blood." Caleb turned. The ground beneath Retta was dark, darker than the night creeping in, spreading. He knew. God help him, he knew exactly what that meant. He had watched it happen in a Virginia cabin while he held Anna's hand and begged to God he was no longer sure existed to let her stay. Josiah worked fast. Yarrow poultice pressed firm against the wound, strips of clean cloth torn and tied, whiskey dabbed to prevent infection. He murmured instructions to Emmeline, who followed each one with precision that surprised him. She knew how to apply pressure. She knew how to check for pulse. She knew the difference between arterial blood and the other kind. "Where did you learn this?" Josiah asked her, even as his hands worked. "My father was sick for 2 years before he died," Emmeline said, pressing cloth against Retta's wound with both hands. "I cared for him every day, changed his bandages, boiled his medicines, learned to read a fever before it read me." Josiah looked at Caleb. Something passed between the brothers. A recognition. This woman was not what she appeared. But the bleeding would not stop. Retta's face had gone the color of milk poured on snow. Her breathing grew shallow, rapid, then slow, then shallow again. The baby began to cry, hungry and insistent, instinct rising above everything else. "Help me," Retta murmured. And Emmeline guided the infant to her mother's chest, and for a moment something like peace settled between them. The child's cries softened into quiet rhythm. The firelight painted them in gold against the vast dark. It was the most beautiful thing Caleb had ever seen, and the most terrible, because he recognized it for what it was. A goodbye. Retta knew, the way the dying always know before anyone tells them. She found Emmeline's hand with fingers that had no strength left in them. Promise me. Do not talk like that. You are going to Oregon with me. I am not going anywhere, Emmy. Retta's eyes drifted to the baby. She needs a mother. You are her mother now. Retta, no. Promise me. Retta's grip tightened one last time. Then she whispered something else. Something that would prove to be the most important words spoken on that Wyoming evening. They were not just bandits, Emmy. The leader, the one with the burn scar on his neck. He kept asking about Phineas Crane, about a strong box. He said Crane cheated his boss, someone in Bitter Creek, someone important. Emmeline leaned close. Who in Bitter Creek? But Retta's eyes were closing. Her voice was almost gone. Be careful. That man, your Phineas Crane, I do not think he was what his letters said. Then she looked at Caleb, the stranger, the mountain man with the weathered face and the whiskey-colored eyes who had brought her daughter into the world. Thank you, she breathed, for being here when she came. Caleb nodded. He could not speak. Retta Porter closed her eyes. Her breathing gentled to a whisper, then to nothing, like a candle flame in a draft. Slow, sudden, gone. Josiah checked her pulse. He held two fingers against the pale skin of her wrist for a long time, longer than was necessary. Then he shook his head. Silence. Only the wind, the fire, and the tiny, insistent crying of a baby searching for warmth that was no longer there. Emmeline Whitmore did not collapse. She did not scream. She did not do any of the things that Caleb expected a 22-year-old girl from Philadelphia to do when death sat down beside her in a creek bed in Wyoming. She picked up the baby. She held her close. She stood up. It cost her. The wound on her hip bled fresh, and her legs shook, and the color left her face. But she stood. Her name is Anna Hope, she said, and the world stopped. Caleb heard the name and felt the ground shift beneath him. Anna, his wife's name, his dead wife's name, spoken by a stranger who did not know and could not have known. The name arrived in the cold air like a hand reaching out from 9 years in the grave to touch his face. Josiah saw it, the look on his brother's face, something beyond surprise, beyond pain, something that looked almost like recognition, as if the universe had just whispered a message that Caleb was not ready to hear. He almost said something. He did not. Wyatt appeared from the darkness, his face hard. We need to move. The tracks I found are fresh. 3 riders heading north, but they split from the main trail. They know the wagon went down. They will circle back by sunrise. Caleb looked at the full picture. Retta was dead. Emmeline was wounded. A newborn baby needed warmth and milk. The wagon was destroyed. The mule was stiff in death. Bandits would return. And to the north, clouds were building thick and low, carrying the sharp scent of snow, though it was still early autumn. Wyoming did not wait for calendars. We bury her, Caleb said. Then we ride south to Bitter Creek. Wyatt stepped forward. This was the moment Caleb had anticipated since they found the women. We do not know these people, Caleb. Wyatt's voice was controlled, but there was an edge beneath it like a blade hidden in cloth. She brought trouble with her. Those bandits were after something, and wherever she goes, they follow. This is not our fight. She is hurt. There is a baby. We are not leaving them. I am not saying leave them. I am saying drop them at the first settlement and ride home. We have our own cabin, our own traps, our own lives. Every mile we ride with her is a mile closer to someone else's war. Josiah spoke softly the way he always did when Wyatt's temper ran hot. Wyatt, look at her. All three brothers looked. Emmeline sat beside the place where they would bury Retta holding baby Anna Hope, against her chest, silent. The red dress was stained with blood and mud and dust, but her back was straight. Her chin was lifted. She was not asking anyone for anything. Something in Wyatt shifted. Not all the way, not yet, but the first crack appeared in his resistance. Fine, he said, but when trouble comes, and it will, I get to say I told you so. They buried Retta Porter by firelight in the soft earth, beside the creek beneath a cottonwood tree that would bloom white in spring, though she would never see it. Caleb read from his Bible the 23rd Psalm, his deep voice carrying across the dark water. Josiah fashioned a cross from wagon planks and pressed it into the soil. Wyatt stood back, arms crossed, jaw tight, looking at nothing in particular. But Caleb noticed that his youngest brother's eyes were not dry. Emmeline spoke last. You were the bravest girl in Missouri, Retta Porter. Your daughter will know that. I swear it. Then she turned to Caleb. How far to Bitter Creek? A day's hard ride, maybe more with the storm coming. Then we should go. No tears, no trembling, just the cold arithmetic of survival. Josiah stitched Emmeline's wound by firelight, while Caleb prepared the horses. She did not cry out. She bit down on a strip of leather and breathed through her nose and kept her eyes open, watching Josiah's hands, learning his technique, the way she had learned everything in her life, by paying attention when nobody expected her to. When it was done, Josiah said, the wound is holding, but infection is starting. The skin is red and warm. She needs carbolic acid, clean bandages, and a proper bed. We have maybe a day before fever sets in. Another clock, ticking. Caleb lifted Emmeline onto his horse. She was light, lighter than he expected, and he almost lost his balance because he had braced for a weight that was not there. His arm went around her waist to steady her. For one breath, her face was close to his. Cornflower held steady against whiskey gold in the near dark. Something passed between them that neither understood and neither named. Then baby Anna Hope cried, and the moment broke like ice on a spring river. They rode. Three brothers and a stranger heading south through the Wyoming dark, with a newborn baby and a dead woman's grave behind them, and a storm gathering above them, and bandits somewhere in the night who would not stay gone forever. Caleb held Emmeline steady with one arm. The baby was nested between them, warm against two heartbeats. The wind pushed hard from the north, carrying the first sting of sleet. Josiah rode close, his own shoulder aching from the tension of the day, watching the baby, checking Emmeline's pallor each time they passed through a patch of moonlight. Wyatt rode rear, silent now, his eyes fixed on the darkness behind them, one hand on his revolver, the other guiding his horse by instinct alone. They had covered perhaps 3 miles when Caleb spotted the figures. 3 riders, cresting a low rise to the east, silhouettes against the bruise-colored sky. He slowed. Josiah. I see them. Wyatt materialized alongside both revolvers already drawn. The 3 brothers formed their triangle without a word spoken. Emmeline felt the shift, the sudden tension in Caleb's arm, the way his body went from tired to alert in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The riders approached, dust-stained coats, rifles slung easy across their saddles, hard eyes that weighed and measured and calculated. The one in front was lean, wiry, built like braided rope. His face was narrow and weathered, and a burn scar crawled from his left ear down to the collar of his coat, livid and pink in the cold light. His eyes were gray, not the soft gray of morning fog, the gray of gunmetal, of tombstones. Silas Crandall. Afternoon, Crandall said, though the sun was long gone. He smiled, and the smile did not come within a mile of his eyes. Caleb nodded once. We are heading south. I can see that. Crandall's gaze moved past Caleb, settled on Emmeline, on the red dress, on the blood. That looks like the woman from the wagon this morning, the one who stuck Dutch with a blade no bigger than a sewing needle. Emmeline met his stare. Her voice was steady as stone. Your man tried to kill us. I defended myself. Something flickered in Crandall's expression. Not anger, something closer to interest. Spirited. Crane had taste, I will give him that. Then his gaze moved back to Caleb and stopped. The gray eyes narrowed. The head tilted. The way a wolf tilts its head when it catches a scent it recognizes from a long time ago. Do I know you? No, Caleb said. Crandall studied him. There is something about your face, friend, something old, something that tugs at a thread in the back of my mind. He paused. No matter. The woman has something that belongs to my employer. A letter, a strong box, some piece of Phineas Crane's business that was supposed to die with him. There is no strong box, Caleb said. There is no letter. She is a mail-order bride carrying a carpet bag and a book. Right on. Wyatt spoke, and his voice held the lazy menace of a man who has calculated the geometry of 3 targets and found it within his capability. There are 3 of you and 3 of us. The difference, friend, is that we are not afraid to die. Are you? Silence, wind, snow beginning to fall, light and sharp as needles. Baby Anna Hope let out a thin cry, and the sound carried across the empty ground between the 2 groups like a question nobody could answer. Crandall heard the baby cry, and for the span of one breath, something crossed his face that was almost human, almost soft. A memory, perhaps, a fragment of something from before the scar and the gun and the long years of hunting other men's debts. Then it was gone. Your funeral, Crandall said. He turned his horse north, but just before the storm swallowed him, he called back through the thickening snow. I remember now, Hawthorne. I will remember. And then they were gone. 3 shapes dissolving into white. Caleb did not breathe fully until the sound of their hooves faded to nothing. Behind him, Emmeline was rigid. Her voice came quiet and controlled. He said he knows you. The war was a long time ago. Caleb, what happened at Coal Creek Bridge? He did not answer. He urged the horse forward into the storm toward whatever waited in the dark. But Emmeline filed the question away. She was a teacher's daughter. She collected questions the way other women collected recipes, and she never forgot to come back for the answers. The snow fell harder. The wind rose to a howl. Within 30 minutes, the world had disappeared. No horizon, no landmark, no direction but instinct and the faint memory of the land that Caleb carried in his bones after 9 years of riding it. Then through the white chaos, a shape, a line of telegraph poles cutting across the plains like a path drawn by man's stubborn will. And beyond them, barely visible, a small structure of rough timber. A signal station abandoned for winter, 4 walls and a crooked stovepipe. It would do. Caleb kicked the door open. The interior was bare. A broken chair, a rusted stove, the smell of mouse droppings and old wood, but out of the wind, out of the killing cold. He settled Emmeline against the far wall. Josiah coaxed fire from the stove using splintered boards pried from the broken chair. Smoke filled the small space before drawing up through the pipe. Warmth came slow but certain. Wyatt brought the horses into the lee of the building and fed them the last of the dried grass from his pack. Outside, the storm raged like a living thing. Inside, four people and a newborn baby huddled around a failing fire and waited for whatever would come next. What came next was the worst of it. Near midnight, the door rattled hard on its hinge. Caleb, who had not slept, was on his feet with his revolver drawn before the second blow landed. Josiah pulled Emmeline and the baby to the far corner. Wyatt, who had been keeping watch from outside, was nowhere to be seen. A voice through the door, familiar, cold. "Open up! We know you are in there!" Silas Crandall. Caleb positioned himself beside the doorframe, his back flat against the wall. If they rushed in straight, they would not see him until it was too late. "There is a woman and an infant in here," he called. "Ride on Crandall." Laughter from outside, low and bitter. "So it is you. I spent all night trying to remember." Cold Creek Bridge, January 1864. "My brother bled out in the snow, screaming my name, and you put a bullet in him like he was nothing." A silence followed that statement, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on the chest and makes breathing difficult. "He was a soldier," Caleb said. "So was I. The war is over." "Not for me." The door shattered inward under a boot. Dutch, the one Emmeline had stabbed that morning, came through first, his good arm swinging a rifle butt. He never saw Caleb. The revolver fired once in the tight space, deafening as a cannon, and Dutch fell before his boots cleared the threshold. Gunfire erupted from outside. Bullets punched through the thin timber walls. The shack filled with smoke and the bitter scent of powder. Caleb fired toward the doorway once, twice, forcing them back. Then from outside, a different sound. Wyatt's revolvers. Both of them, barking in rapid succession from a position behind the attackers. Pike, the silent one, screamed as a bullet found his shoulder. He stumbled into the storm, bleeding, and vanished. Crandall's voice ragged now. "This is not finished, Hawthorne. Cold Creek Bridge is not finished. I will come for you, not tonight, but I will come." Then hooves, fading, swallowed by the blizzard. Silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence now, the kind that follows violence. Heavy, ringing. Wyatt appeared in the shattered doorway, snow on his shoulders, both revolvers smoking. He looked at Dutch's body. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Emmeline. She was pressed against the far wall, her body curved around baby Anna Hope like a shell around a pearl. Her back had been toward the door, toward the bullets. She had used herself as a shield. The baby was quiet, unharmed. "You all right?" Wyatt asked her. She nodded. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were clear. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. Something final shifted in his expression. The last wall of resistance fell. She was no longer troublemaker. She was no longer a stranger. She was something that Wyatt Hawthorne, who had never protected anything smaller than a horse in his entire life, would kill or die to keep safe. He did not say any of this. He simply took off his coat and laid it over her shoulders. "Storm is dying," he said. "I will ride for help at first light." And he did. Before dawn had fully broken, Wyatt Hawthorne rode south through the last gasps of the blizzard, following the telegraph poles toward Bitter Creek. 3 hours later, he returned with Marshal Virgil Cole and two rail deputies carrying medicine blankets and a sled. Cole surveyed the scene, Dutch dead in the doorway, the shack riddled with bullet holes, a young woman with a wound in her side holding a 2-day-old baby, 3 mountain men who looked like they had crawled out of the wilderness itself. Crandall's gang, Cole said. We have been hunting them along the rail line for months. He looked at Caleb. You people are lucky to be alive. Luck had nothing to do with it, Wyatt said. He was looking at Emmeline when he said it. They rode for Bitter Creek as the sun broke clean and golden over a world remade in white. The storm had passed, the sky stretched blue and enormous overhead. Snow covered everything, and the light that bounced off it was so bright it hurt the eyes. Emmeline sat before Caleb on the horse, his arms steady around her. Baby Anna Hope slept between them, warm against two heartbeats that had begun without either owner's permission to fall into the same rhythm. Bitter Creek appeared through the morning glare, a small town built around a rail spur, a handful of wooden buildings, a saloon with a crooked sign, a church with a bell tower, a livery stable burned to its foundations last spring, nothing left but charred beams and cracked stone. And the Caldwell boarding house, the largest structure in town, 2 stories of whitewashed wood with a wide porch and lace curtains in the windows. Mrs. Agnes Caldwell opened her door before they reached it. She was a broad woman with iron gray hair, pinned tight, hands hardened by 30 years of milking cows and kneading bread, and eyes that had seen enough trouble to never be surprised by it again. Get them inside, she ordered. Now. And warmth swallowed them. Real warmth. The kind that settles into bone and marrow and drives out the memory of cold. The boarding house smelled of pine wood and fresh bread and lye soap. It smelled like civilization, like safety, like something Emmeline had not known since leaving Philadelphia. She was laid in a proper bed, clean linens, hot water, a basin. Mrs. Caldwell examined the wound with practiced hands and said to Josiah, "You did well, boy." The yarrow poultice slowed the infection. Another few hours and the blood poisoning would have taken her. She applied carbolic acid, real medicine brought in on the supply train, and Emmeline bit down hard and did not make a sound. Baby Anna Hope was taken to Nettie Garrett, the blacksmith's wife who had given birth 3 weeks prior and had milk to spare. For the first time, the child was properly nourished. She drank greedily, and Nettie smiled down at her and said, "This one is a fighter, born in a storm and still hollering. That is a sign of something." The 3 Hawthorne brothers stood in the parlor of the boarding house, 3 enormous men in a room built for lace doilies and china plates, looking as out of place as wolves at a tea party. Caleb stood near the door, hat in his hands, ready to leave at any moment. Josiah sat in a chair too small for him, hands between his knees, exhaustion written across his face. Wyatt leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, his eyes still scanning the room, as if expecting the walls themselves to produce a threat. Mrs. Caldwell brought 3 bowls of beef stew, thick and steaming, with sourdough bread and black coffee. The brothers ate without speaking, the silence of men too hungry for words. Mrs. Caldwell watched them with the expression of a woman who had raised sons and buried a husband and understood that feeding people was the closest thing to prayer that existed on this earth. "The Hawthorne brothers," she said when they had finished. "I have heard of you. You trade furs at Jensen's store twice a year. Never stay more than 1 night. Never speak a word beyond what is necessary." "We value our privacy," Caleb said. Mrs. Caldwell picked up her teacup, took a slow sip, set it down. "Privacy and isolation are not the same thing, Mr. Hawthorne. One is a choice, the other is a prison." Caleb did not answer, but the words landed somewhere deep inside him, in the place where Anna's name still echoed, where baby Anna Hope's name had struck like a bell, where Emmeline Whitmore's blue eyes had looked into his and said, "Come back to us." Winter always ends, he thought, but what you build in the cold that lasts forever. He did not know yet where the thought had come from. He did not know that it would become the most important sentence of his life. Outside the boarding house window, the snow glittered under clean morning light. The plains stretched endless and white, and somewhere to the north, Silas Crandall rode with a bullet wound and a memory that would not rest, and a debt he believed could only be paid in blood. And somewhere in this very town, behind a polished desk in an office above the saloon, Mayor Harlan Briggs sat with a glass of whiskey and stared at the wall and thought about a girl in a red dress who should have died on the Wyoming flats but did not. He would need to deal with that soon. The first week in Bitter Creek passed the way snow melts in March, slowly, then all at once. Emmeline woke on the third morning to sunlight streaming through frost-lined windows and the sound of hammering. Not the frantic hammering of emergency or repair, but the steady rhythmic kind. The kind that says someone is building something. Someone has decided to stay long enough to make a mark on the earth. She pushed herself upright in the narrow bed. The wound on her hip pulled a dull ache that reminded her with each breath that she was unsafe and that being alive sometimes costs something. Mrs. Caldwell had changed the bandages twice daily, applying carbolic acid with the calm efficiency of a woman who had doctored everything from snake bite to broken femurs in her 30 years on the frontier. The infection was retreating, the redness fading, but Emmeline would carry that scar for the rest of her life, a thin white line across her left hip, shaped like a crescent moon, the signature of a man named Dutch, who would never sign anything again. She went to the window. Below in the yard where the old livery stable had burned to its skeleton last spring, 3 men worked. Caleb Hawthorne stood at the center of it, stripped to his shirt sleeves, despite the cold, swinging a splitting maul into a hickory log with a force that made the ground tremble. Each stroke landed exactly where he intended. The wood parted clean, falling in 2 halves that steamed faintly in the morning air. His shoulders rolled with the motion, the muscles of his back visible through the thin cotton, working in a rhythm as old as labor itself. Josiah crouched nearby with a draw knife in his hands, shaving a beam smooth with long, even strokes. Curls of pale wood fell around his boots. He worked with the patience of a man who understood that the difference between a good joint and a bad one was measured in fractions of an inch, and that cutting corners in November meant frozen horses in January. Wyatt stood on the frame they had already raised, balanced on a crossbeam 6 feet off the ground, driving nails with a forge hammer. Each blow rang out clean and sharp against the morning quiet. He worked without gloves. His knuckles were split and bleeding in 3 places. He did not seem to notice. Emmeline watched them for a long time. She watched the way they moved around each other without speaking, passing tools by instinct, shifting positions as if choreographed by some invisible hand. She watched Caleb pause between swings to wipe his brow and look up at the sky, reading the clouds, the way a scholar reads a page, calculating how many hours of dry weather remained. She watched him resume the work, and with that quiet sadness, she was beginning to recognize the sadness of a man who builds beautifully but does not believe he deserves to live inside what he creates. Folks, I want you to understand something about this moment because it seems small. A woman at a window watching a man chop wood. But this is where the story turns, not with a gunshot or a blizzard or a villain's scheme. It turns here in the silence between heartbeats, when Emmeline Grace Whitmore looks down at Caleb Hawthorne and thinks, I have never seen anyone that strong look that lonely. And that thought was more dangerous than any bandit on the Wyoming plains. By the end of the first week, the livery frame was up. 4 walls of Wyoming pine squared and notched, and fitted by hands that knew wood the way a preacher knows scripture. By the end of the second week, the roof was on. Cedar shingles split by Caleb himself using a froen mallet, each one tapped into place with a precision that made old man Jensen at the general store shake his head and mutter to his wife, "Caleb Hawthorne has not stayed in Bitter Creek longer than one night in 9 years. Now he is building a barn. If that is not a sign of the end times, I do not know what is." His wife looked out of the window at the boarding house porch where a young woman with honey blonde hair sat reading aloud to 5 children. "It is not the end times, Harold," she said. "It is a woman in a red dress." Emmeline had found her purpose within days. There were 5 children in Bitter Creek ranging from 4 to 11, and not a single one of them could read. There was no school, no teacher. No one had thought it necessary because in a town built around a rail spur and a saloon, what use was Shakespeare to a child who needed to know how to shoe a horse? But Emmeline Whitmore was the daughter of Edward Whitmore, schoolteacher, and Catherine Whitmore, the woman who had taught her to read before she could tie her own laces. Education was not a luxury to Emmeline, it was oxygen, and these children were suffocating. She began on the boarding house porch with a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe that Mrs. Caldwell found in a trunk. 5 faces looked up at her, dirty and skeptical, and secretly hungry for something they could not name. Emmeline read the first chapter aloud. By the 3rd page, the skepticism was gone. By the end of the chapter, the smallest child, a girl named Polly with braids and no front teeth, had climbed into Emmeline's lap and fallen asleep with her thumb in her mouth. Within a week, there were 8 children. Within 2 weeks, 12. Mothers from the surrounding cattle ranches rode in specifically for the reading hours. Lingering on the porch with coffee cups, watching this city woman, with her elegant vowels and her patient hands, turn their wild frontier children into something quieter. Something that sat still and listened and asked questions that had answers beyond "because I said so." Mrs. Caldwell watched from the kitchen window and smiled. It was the first time anyone in Bitter Creek had seen Agnes Caldwell smile since her husband Franklin was kicked by a draft horse 12 years ago and buried in the plot behind the church. "This town needs a teacher more than it needs a livery," she said softly to herself. "But I suppose we will take both." Emmeline also helped Mrs. Caldwell with the boarding house accounts. This was where her father's gift showed itself in a different form. Edward Whitmore had taught mathematics as well as literature, and his daughter could add a column of figures faster than most men could count to 10. She sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Caldwell's ledger, a pencil behind her ear, and ran through 3 months of expenses in an hour. And she found something. Not immediately, not on the first pass, but on the second review a pattern emerged. The cost of building materials purchased for town repairs. Lumber nails, hinges, glass, all bought through Jensen's general store at prices approved by the mayor's office. Prices that were 40 to 60% higher than the standard wholesale rates listed in the Cheyenne Supply catalog that came on last month's train. Emmeline stared at the numbers. She checked them twice, 3 times. The overcharges were consistent. Month after month, someone was inflating the prices and pocketing the difference, and every receipt bore the same approval stamp, Office of the Mayor, Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory. She closed the ledger. She did not say anything. Not yet. Instead, she found a small notebook in her carpet bag, the kind her father used for grading, and she began to write. 3 days after the livery frame went up, Mayor Harlan Briggs came to call. He arrived at the boarding house at precisely 10 in the morning, which in itself was unusual because Harlan Briggs was not a man who visited people. People visited him. He held court in his office above the saloon, a room furnished with a mahogany desk imported from St. Louis, a leather chair, and a portrait of himself that made him look 15 years younger and 30 pounds lighter. He was 55 years old with silver hair swept back from a high forehead, a smile that showed too many teeth and hands that were soft as a child's. He wore a black vest over a pressed white shirt, a silk cravat, and boots that had never seen mud. In a town where every man's hands told the story of his labor, Harlan Briggs's hands told a different story entirely. He entered the boarding house parlor with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to owning every room he walked into. "Miss Whitmore," he said, extending his hand. "Harlan Briggs, mayor of Bitter Creek. I heard about your terrible ordeal on the road. Please accept my deepest sympathies." Emmeline took his hand. His grip was firm, but his skin was smooth, and something about the contrast made her think of her Uncle Robert in Philadelphia, the lawyer who had stolen her father's house. He had the same handshake, warm on the surface, cold underneath. "Thank you, Mayor. That is kind of you." Briggs settled into the best chair without being invited. Bahuabanabdans. He crossed his legs. He surveyed the room the way a landlord surveys a property assessing value. "Phineas Crane," he said, and the name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. "He was a business associate of mine, a good man. His death was a tragedy. A robbery," the sheriff said. He paused. "I understand you were traveling to Oregon to be his bride." "I was." "And you had no knowledge of his passing before you departed?" "None." Briggs nodded slowly. Then, with the careful casualness of a man who has rehearsed his next words, "Phineas, did he send anything with your documents, perhaps? A strong box? Any item of business significance?" The question hit Emmeline like cold water, because she had heard it before, in a different voice, on a different morning, from a man with a burn scar on his neck who had killed her driver and slashed her side. The same question, the same words. Strongbox. She kept her face still, a skill learned from years of teaching rich children who mocked her poverty from standing in drawing rooms where she was treated as furniture from watching her father die slowly while her uncle counted the days until he could claim the house. "No," she said. "I brought only my clothes and a few personal items." Briggs studied her. His smile remained, but behind his eyes, calculations turned like gears in a clock. "Of course," he said. "Well, if you find anything among your belongings that seems connected to Phineas's business affairs, I would consider it a personal favor if you brought it to my attention. For the settling of his estate, you understand." "I understand perfectly, Mayor Briggs." He left. The front door closed with a soft click. Mrs. Caldwell appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. She had been listening. Of course she had been listening. Agnes Caldwell had not survived 30 years in Bitter Creek by failing to listen when powerful men asked quiet questions. "Be careful with that one child," she said. "Harlan Briggs does not come calling without a reason, and his reasons never benefit anyone but Harlan Briggs." Emily nodded, but inside a voice was speaking clearly. The voice of the girl who had survived. Philadelphia survived. The road survived a knife wound and a blizzard and the death of her only friend. He used the word strongbox, the exact word the bandit used. "And I have never mentioned a strongbox to anyone in Bitter Creek." She opened her notebook, she wrote the date, and she kept writing. "Now I need you to understand what was happening in Caleb Hawthorne's chest during these weeks, because the man himself would never tell you. He would sooner chew gravel than speak about feelings. But I am telling this story, and I owe you the truth." Every morning, Caleb rose before dawn and walked from the small room above the livery where he slept to the well behind the boarding house. He drew water. He carried it to the kitchen door and left it there. He never knocked. He never waited for thanks. He simply left the water and went to work. Every evening after the hammering stopped and the sawdust was swept, and his shoulders ached from a day of lifting timber that most men would need two hands and a mule to move. He passed by the boarding house porch, and every evening Emmeline was there, sometimes reading to the children, sometimes sitting with baby Anna Hope in her arms wrapped in the quilt that Nettie Garrett had sewn from scraps. Sometimes just looking at the mountains, her face unreadable, the golden light of sunset turning her hair to something that hurt to look at. He never stopped walking. He tipped his hat. She nodded, that was all. But Josiah noticed. Josiah noticed everything. You could talk to her, he said one evening, as the brothers sat around a fire in the livery, eating stew from tin plates. I talked to her. You tip your hat. That is not talking, Caleb. That is what a man does to a stranger on a road. She is a stranger on a road. Josiah set down his plate. Brother, you built her a bookshelf. Caleb's jaw tightened. He had in fact built a bookshelf. A small one. 3 shelves made from pine sanded smooth with a piece of shark skin he had traded from a peddler 2 years ago. He had built it in the pre-dawn hours when his brothers were asleep, working by lantern light, fitting the joints with the same care he gave to rifle stocks. He had placed it on the windowsill of Emmeline's room without note or explanation. The next morning he had walked past her window and seen it. His Bible, the one he had carried since Virginia, the one he had read over Retta Porter's grave, was standing on the shelf beside a green-covered book titled Jane Eyre, his book, beside her book. On the shelf he had built, he had stopped walking for 3 full seconds, which for Caleb Hawthorne was the equivalent of a lesser man falling to his knees. The bookshelf was practical, he said to Josiah. She had books on the floor. Josiah smiled into his coffee. He said nothing more. He did not need to. And that, my friends, is the part I think about most often. A man who cannot say I love you, so he builds a shelf instead. And a woman who cannot say I see you, so she puts his book beside hers. 2 people speaking in wood and paper because words are too big and too frightening and too close to the thing they both lost the last time they dared to feel it. It was Wyatt who surprised everyone. The youngest Hawthorne had stopped complaining about Emmeline within days of arriving in Bitter Creek. He had stopped calling the situation someone else's war. He had not in fact said a single negative word about Emmeline Whitmore since the night in the signal station when she curved her body around baby Anna Hope and used herself as a shield against flying bullets. But what nobody expected was what he did with the baby. It started simply. Anna Hope cried at night. Emmeline's wound made it difficult to rise quickly, and Mrs. Caldwell, though willing, was a heavy sleeper. Wyatt, who slept in the livery loft above Caleb and Josiah, and who had the lightest sleep of anyone in the family, because 9 years on the frontier had taught him that the man who sleeps deep dies young, began appearing at the boarding house door in the small hours. He never announced himself. He simply picked up the baby when she cried, held her against his chest, and walked. Back and forth across the boarding house parlor, his boots silent on the wooden floor, his enormous scarred hands cradling the infant with a care that defied everything anyone thought they knew about Wyatt Hawthorne. And he hummed, not a song exactly, a vibration deep in his chest, a melody so old and so buried that Wyatt himself could not have named it if you asked. It was the lullaby their mother, Eleanor, had sung in the Virginia house before the fever took her when Wyatt was 8, and the world still made sense. Anna Hope always quieted, every single time. She would open her dark eyes, look up at Wyatt's scarred face, and reach one tiny hand toward his stubbled chin. And every single time, something in Wyatt's expression would change, soften, crack open, reveal a tenderness so unexpected that it was like finding a wildflower growing through a crack in solid granite. One morning before dawn, Emmeline caught him at it. She stood in the doorway of the parlor, wrapped in a shawl, and watched Wyatt Hawthorne, the gunfighter, the hothead, the man who had called her trouble on the first night, whispering to a sleeping baby. You listen to me, little one. This territory is not kind to the weak, so you are going to grow up strong. I am going to teach you to ride before you can walk. And if any boy ever makes you cry, I will make him sorry his mother brought him into this world. A pause, softer. But I will also teach you the name of every wildflower on these mountains because your Mama Retta would have wanted that. Emmeline pressed her hand against her mouth. Tears ran, but she was smiling. When Wyatt turned and saw her, his face went crimson from collar to hairline. I was checking if the fire needed wood, he said. Of course you were, Emmeline replied. And Wyatt Hawthorne smiled. A real smile. Not the sharp, challenging grin he wore in saloons. Not the bitter twist that passed for humor on the trail. A genuine, unguarded smile, rare as summer rain in Wyoming and worth twice as much. 3 weeks passed. The livery was nearly complete. Emmeline's wound had healed enough for her to walk without wincing. Baby Anna Hope was thriving, her dark hair growing thick, her lungs powerful enough to wake the whole boarding house when the mood struck her. The first real snowfall had come and gone, laying a white blanket across Bitter Creek that made the ugly little town look for a few hours almost beautiful. And then came the evening that changed everything between Caleb Hawthorne and Emmeline Whitmore. It was late, past midnight. The boarding house was dark. Emmeline had come out to the porch because sleep would not come, and the cold air helped quiet the thoughts that turned and turned in her mind like a wheel on a broken axle. Caleb was already there, standing at the rail looking at the moon over the snow-covered mountains. He did not seem surprised to see her. Perhaps he had been waiting without knowing he was waiting. They stood in silence for a while, the kind of silence that has no awkwardness in it, the kind shared by people who have survived something together and do not need words to acknowledge it. Then Caleb spoke, and what he said he had not said aloud in 9 years. My wife's name was Anna. Emmeline turned to him. The moonlight caught her face, and for a moment she looked very young and very old at the same time. The baby, she said softly. I named her Anna Hope. I did not know. I know you did not. The name just came to you. Yes. Maybe some things are not coincidence. Another silence. The moon moved a degree across the sky. A coyote called somewhere far off and another answered, and the two voices braided together in the cold dark like a conversation in a language only they understood. What was she like? Emmeline asked. You're Anna. Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then, kind, stubborn, she laughed too loud. The neighbors heard it 2 fields over. She read books by candlelight until the wax pooled on the table, and I had to buy new ones every month. She made the worst coffee in Virginia, and I drank every cup like it was the finest thing I ever tasted. He stopped. She never backed down from anything. Not once, not ever. She sounds wonderful. She was. He turned to look at Emmeline. In the moonlight, his amber eyes were dark and deep, and what lived behind them was not grief anymore. Not entirely. It was something newer. Something that frightened him more than Coal Creek Bridge, more than the fever that nearly killed him, more than Silas Crandall's gray eyes promising revenge. You remind me of her, he said. Not the face, not the voice, but the way you stand in the middle of a storm and refuse to fall. Emmeline felt the words land in her chest, warm, heavy, like a stone pulled from a fire. Caleb, why did you build me a bookshelf? He looked away, then back. Because you put my Bible beside your book. Nobody ever did that before. Nobody ever said your words and my words belong in the same place. The air between them changed, thickened, grew warm despite the cold. Emmeline shivered and Caleb took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. His hand brushed her collarbone through the fabric. Just a touch, barely a second, but it sent a current through both of them that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with 9 years of loneliness meeting 22 years of never being chosen. Neither of them moved closer. Neither moved away. They stood in the moonlight on the porch of a boarding house in a town so small it barely existed, and they breathed the same cold air, and that was enough. For now. Inside the parlor, unseen by either of them, Josiah Hawthorne sat in the dark with a cup of cold coffee and a smile on his face that said, finally. But the peace did not last. In Bitter Creek, peace never lasted. Harlan Briggs made his move on a Tuesday. First, he raised the boarding house rent, doubled it overnight, citing municipal improvements that no one could identify. Mrs. Caldwell received the notice and read it with the expression of a woman who has just been told the sun will rise in the west tomorrow. Second, he sent a letter to Caleb Hawthorne, informing him that the land where the livery was being built was municipal property, and that construction required a permit from the mayor's office. Cost of permit, $200. More than Caleb would earn in 6 months of trapping. Third, and this was the cruelest move, he spoke, quietly, casually in the saloon at Jensen's counter after church on Sunday. He mentioned that Emmeline Whitmore was the intended bride of Phineas Crane. He mentioned that Crane had been a cheat and a fraud. He mentioned that anyone who married a swindler's bride was likely to inherit a swindler's debts. He did not accuse. He did not threaten. He simply planted seeds and let the Wyoming wind carry them. Within a week, 2 families pulled their children from Emmeline's reading hours. Mrs. Dalrymple, the preacher's wife, crossed the street rather than walk past the boarding house. Old man Jensen stopped making eye contact when Emmeline came to buy supplies. Emmeline noticed all of it. She said nothing. She continued reading to the children who remained. She continued helping Mrs. Caldwell with the accounts. She continued writing in her notebook page after page in the all neat handwriting that her father had taught her. Wyatt was the first to react. He stormed into the livery where Caleb was planting a beam and said, "Let me talk to Briggs," with my fists. "No, he is poisoning this town against her, Caleb, against us. He doubled Caldwell's rent. He wants $200 for a permit that should cost $10. I know. Then let me handle it." Wyatt, Caleb set down the plane. He looked at his brother. Briggs has power. He has the law on his side, or at least the appearance of it. Punching him gives him exactly what he wants, a reason to have us arrested and removed. Then what do? It was Emmeline who answered. She appeared in the livery doorway, baby Anna Hope, in one arm, notebook in the other. The late afternoon sun behind her turned the red dress to flame. "I have something," she said. She opened the notebook on Caleb's workbench. Page after page of figures, dates, amounts. Every overcharged invoice, every inflated price, every discrepancy between what Bitter Creek paid for building materials and what those materials actually cost according to the Cheyenne wholesale catalog. Harlan Briggs has been skimming from the town budget for at least 3 years, she said. Not large amounts individually, but consistently. The total comes to over $400. That is more than the annual salary of a deputy marshal. Caleb looked at the numbers, then at her. "How did you find this?" "I can read numbers, Caleb. My father was a teacher. Numbers do not lie, and they do not care who the mayor is." Wyatt leaned over the notebook. His lips moved as he followed the columns. He was not a numbers man, but even he could see the pattern. $400. That would buy a lot of permits. Josiah, who had entered quietly behind Emmeline, spoke from the corner. It is good, but it is not enough. Not yet. Briggs will say the prices reflect transportation costs, frontier markup, administrative fees. He will have an answer for everything. Then we need more, Emmeline said. We need the connection between Briggs and Phineas Crane. We need to prove that Crane was laundering gold through his store on Briggs's orders. And we need to prove that the men who attacked my wagon were working for Briggs. She said it calmly, the way a general describes a battle plan, the way a chess player describes the next four moves. Caleb stared at her, and for the first time he understood something that he had been too close to see. Emmeline Whitmore was not a woman who needed saving. She was a woman who had been saving herself her entire life. She had nursed her dying father for 2 years. She had survived her uncle's theft. She had answered a stranger's advertisement and traveled 2,000 miles alone. She had fought off a bandit with a knife meant for cutting paper. She had held her friend's hand while she died. She had shielded a baby with her own body while bullets tore through the walls around her. And now she was sitting in a Wyoming livery stable reading numbers off a page, calmly dismantling the most powerful man in town with nothing but a pencil and a notebook. Winter always ends, he thought again, but what you build in the cold that lasts forever. He looked at the notebook. He looked at her. He said, then we get more. That night, someone threw a rock through the boarding house window. Wrapped around it was a piece of paper with 3 words scratched in charcoal. Leave or regret. Caleb found it first. He read it. His jaw set in that way that Josiah and Wyatt had learned to recognize over 20 years as the look that preceded very bad decisions by the people who had provoked it. He walked to the porch. Wyatt was already there, rifle across his knees as if he had known. Wyatt, I know. We are not leaving Bitter Creek. Wyatt looked at his eldest brother. In the darkness, both men's eyes caught the light from the parlor window behind them. Amber meeting Amber. Hawthorne meeting Hawthorne. First time in 9 years you have wanted to stay anywhere, Wyatt said. First time in 9 years there has been a reason. Wyatt nodded. Once. The nod of a man who understood that what his brother was really saying had nothing to do with livery stables or permits, or even Harlan Briggs. Then we stay, Wyatt said. All of us, whatever comes. From inside the boarding house through the broken window came the thin, sweet sound of a baby crying, and then softer the sound of Emmeline's voice singing something low and wordless and warm. Anna Hope quieted. The night settled. The stars burned cold and bright above Bitter Creek, and somewhere in the mountains a wolf called out to something it could not see, and the sound carried down through the pines and across the snow and into the hearts of every living creature who heard it. Winter always ends, but what you build in the cold lasts forever, and Caleb Hawthorne, for the first time in 9 years, was building. Caleb left for the high timber on a Thursday morning when the sky was the color of iron and the air tasted of metal and cold. The livery needed more lumber. The walls were up and the roof was on, but the interior still lacked stalls, feed troughs, and a proper hayloft. Good hickory and white pine grew thick on the mountain slopes 3 days north of Bitter Creek, and Caleb knew a stand of timber near a creek called Elk Fork where the trees grew straight and tall and the wood split clean. Josiah rode with him. 2 pack mules carried axes, rope chains, and enough dried provisions for a week. Wyatt stayed behind. No one discussed why. No one needed to. Wyatt stayed because Emmeline and baby Anna Hope were in Bitter Creek, and the rock through the window 3 nights ago had made it clear that someone wanted them gone. Emmeline stood on the boarding house porch as the 2 riders disappeared into the gray morning. Baby Anna Hope was bundled against her chest, wrapped in netty gurry. Ah, well, making the small, contented sounds that infants make when they are warm and fed and do not yet know that the world contains anything worth fearing. Be careful, Emmeline said. She did not say it loudly, but Caleb heard it. He turned in the saddle and touched the brim of his hat. One gesture, then he was gone. She did not know it yet, but 72 hours from that moment, she would be riding into those same mountains with nothing but a medical kit and the stubborn refusal to let a man she was only beginning to love die without her. Now, folks, I have told stories around many fires, and this next part is the one that keeps me up at night. Not because of the violence, though there is some. Not because of the danger, though, Lord knows there is plenty. It is because of what it reveals about the kind of strength that does not announce itself, the kind that lives quietly in small hands and steady voices, and the refusal, the absolute stubborn refusal to let someone you love die alone on a mountainside. 2 days into the timber, Caleb and Josiah made camp near Elk Fork. They had felled 6 good pines and were trimming the branches when Josiah noticed the tracks. Horse prints in the snow fresh coming from the southeast. 3 riders, moving parallel to their trail but staying just out of sight beyond the ridgeline. Could be hunters, Josiah said, but his hand was already on his rifle. Could be, Caleb agreed. His was already loaded. The ambush came at dawn on the 3rd day. Caleb was kneeling by the creek filling his canteen when the first shot cracked through the morning air and punched a hole in the ice 2 inches from his hand. He rolled sideways on instinct, 9 years of frontier survival compressing into a single fluid motion, and came up behind a fallen log with his revolver drawn. The second shot hit the log. Bark exploded outward. A third shot sang past his ear, close enough that he felt the heat of it. Josiah was 40 yards away near the mules. He had his rifle up and was scanning the tree line when a figure stepped out from behind a boulder. Lean, wiry, burn scar crawling from ear to collar. Silas Crandall. Cold Creek Bridge Hawthorne, Crandall called across the snow. His voice carried flat and hard in the mountain air. 15 years I have waited. Your mayor friend paid me to come, but I would have come for free. The words landed on Caleb like stones. Briggs. Briggs had sent Crandall. The connection between the corrupt mayor and the outlaw was not just old business with Phineas Crane. It was current, active, and aimed directly at him. 2 more men emerged from the trees, not Pike, who had disappeared after the signal station fight with a bullet in his shoulder. New faces, hired guns, the kind of men who came cheap and left cheaper. What happened next took less than 90 seconds, but would play in Caleb's memory and in Josiah's for the rest of their lives. Josiah fired first. His rifle boomed and one of the hired guns spun and fell. The second man returned fire, and Josiah grunted as a bullet tore through the meat of his left shoulder. He went down on one knee but did not drop the rifle. He fired again, and the second hired gun dove behind a rock. Caleb rose from behind the log and fired at Crandall. The shot went wide. Crandall returned fire with a speed that spoke of years of practice, and the bullet grazed Caleb's temple. Not deep, not fatal, but enough. The world tilted, colors blurred, his knees buckled. He fell. The snow caught him, cold and white and absolute. He lay face down, blood running from the crease above his ear, staining the snow in a spreading halo of red. His fingers opened. The revolver slipped away. Crandall walked toward him, slow, deliberate. The crunch of his boots on frozen ground was the only sound in the world. My brother's name was Billy, Crandall said. He was 16 years old. He had blonde hair and a gap in his teeth, and he used to whittle animals out of pine bark. Birds mostly. He wanted to be a carpenter. His voice cracked on the last word. You took that from him. You took everything from him. Caleb tried to rise. His arms would not obey. The mountain spun around him. Then Josiah's rifle spoke again. The shot hit the rock beside Crandall's head, spraying fragments. Crandall flinched, turned, and saw Josiah on one knee, shoulder, bleeding, rifle-leveled, eyes clear as creek water. "Next one does not miss," Josiah said. Crandall looked at Josiah, looked at Caleb, bleeding in the snow, looked at the dead man and the man behind the rock. The arithmetic was bad and getting worse. He was a hunter, not a fool. He backed away. 3 steps, 5. Then he turned and vanished into the tree line like smoke. Josiah crawled to Caleb. His own shoulder was bleeding freely, soaking through his shirt, but he ignored it with the practiced dismissal of a man who has treated worse on others and would not waste attention on himself. "Caleb, Caleb, stay with me." But Caleb's eyes were closed, his breathing was shallow. The wound on his temple, though not deep, had rattled his brain the way a bell is rattled by a hammer. He was alive, but he was somewhere else. Josiah dragged his brother to a shallow cave beneath a rock overhang. He packed snow against the wound to slow the bleeding. He tore strips from his own shirt and bound both his shoulder and Caleb's head. He built a small fire with one functional arm and hands that shook from cold and blood loss. Then he sat down beside his brother, his back against stone, his rifle across his knees, and he waited. He could not leave. He could not carry Caleb 3 days through mountain snow with one working arm. He could not send for help because there was no one to send. The horses had bolted during the gunfire. One of them, Caleb's bay gelding, ran south. It ran for a day and a half through snow and wind and terrain that would have killed a lesser animal. It ran until it reached a place it recognized, the livery stable in Bitter Creek, with its fresh pine walls and the smell of hay and grain. It arrived at dusk. Bloody saddle, no rider. Wyatt saw it first. The color left his face like water poured from a glass. He caught the horse's reins, checked the saddle, found the blood. He ran to the boarding house. He did not knock. He pushed through the door and found Emmeline in the parlor reading to Anna Hope by lamplight. "Caleb's horse came back alone," he said. "The saddle is bloody." Emmeline closed the book. She set the baby down in the cradle that Josiah had built from applewood. She stood. "I am going," she said. "You cannot. The mountains are 3 days' ride. You do not know the trails." "The horse knows the trail. It just ran it. It will take me back the same way it came." Wyatt stared at her. "You are not serious." "Wyatt, your brother is somewhere on that mountain hurt, or worse. Josiah is with him, but Josiah may be hurt too. I know how to treat wounds. I know how to read a fever. I know what infection looks like before it becomes blood poisoning." "Do you?" Wyatt opened his mouth, closed it. "I nursed my father for 2 years, Emmeline said, and her voice was steady as a plumb line. "I changed his bandages every day. I boiled his medicines. I sat beside his bed through fevers that should have killed him 6 months before they finally did. I am not a frontier woman, Wyatt, but I know how to keep someone alive." Mrs. Caldwell appeared in the doorway. She looked at Emmeline. She looked at Wyatt. She reached out her arms for baby Anna Hope. "Go," she said. "I will keep the child. Go bring those fool men home." Emmeline kissed Anna Hope's forehead. The baby gurgled and reached for her with tiny hands, not understanding why her mother was putting on a coat and gloves and walking toward the door instead of toward the rocking chair. "I will come back," Emmeline whispered. "I promise." She rode out of Bitter Creek on Caleb's bay gelding as the last light died behind the mountains. Wyatt rode beside her, armed with both revolvers and a Winchester rifle, and the cold fury of a man whose family was bleeding somewhere in the dark. The horse knew the way. It followed its own trail back through the snow, north through the foothills into the timber, up along creek beds and through pine forests so dense the moonlight barely reached the ground. Emmeline rode in silence. Her hands gripped the reins so hard her knuckles went white. The wound on her hip ached with every stride. She ignored it. She ignored the cold. She ignored the fear that sat in her stomach like a swallowed stone. She thought about Caleb, about his hands so large and so gentle when he held Anna Hope, about his voice reading the psalm over Retta's grave, about the bookshelf on her windowsill. 3 shelves of pine sanded smooth, holding his words and her words side by side. She thought I did not come 2,000 miles to lose him now. They found the camp at Elk Fork near dawn. The fire had burned down to embers. A dead man lay face down in the snow 30 yards from the cave. Josiah was sitting against the rock wall, his face gray, his shoulder crudely bandaged, his rifle still across his knees. His eyes opened when he heard the horses. "Took you long enough," he whispered. And then his head fell forward. Emmeline was off the horse before it stopped moving. Caleb lay deeper in the cave, wrapped in a blanket, breathing but not conscious. The wound on his temple had stopped bleeding, but the skin around it was swollen and hot. His eyes moved behind closed lids. His lips formed words that had no sound. And then in his fever, one word broke through. A name. Anna. Not Emmeline. Anna, his dead wife. Emmeline knelt beside him. She took his hand. It was enormous in hers, rough and calloused and burning with fever. "I am here," she said quietly. "Not Anna. But I am here, and I am not going anywhere." Caleb's fingers tightened around hers. His lips moved again, and this time the name was different. Emmeline. It was the first time he had spoken her name without the formal distance of Miss Whitmore. Just her name, spoken in fever and darkness in a cave on a Wyoming mountain where the wind howled outside like a living thing. It sounded like a prayer. She got to work. Wyatt carried water from the creek. Emmeline cleaned Caleb's wound with whiskey, stitched it with needle and thread from Josiah's medical kit, applied a yarrow poultice that Josiah, even half-conscious, talked her through making. She treated Josiah's shoulder, next cutting away the crusted bandage, cleaning the bullet wound, packing it with the same poultice. Through the night she worked, changed bandages every 2 hours, boiled water for broth, fed both men sips of warm liquid by tipping the tin cup against their lips with steady hands. She did not sleep. She could not. Every time she paused, she checked Caleb's forehead for the heat that meant the infection was winning. Near midnight, the fever peaked. Caleb's entire body shook. His teeth chattered so hard it sounded like stones rattling in a jar. Emmeline wrapped every blanket around him, and then because there was nothing else left and the fire was not enough, she lay beside him and held him. Not as a lover holds a beloved, as a survivor holds another survivor. Body heat against body heat, heartbeat against heartbeat. "You are not dying, Caleb Hawthorne," she said into the dark. "Not on this mountain, not anywhere I can prevent it." By dawn, the shaking stopped. The fever broke like a wave receding from shore. Caleb's breathing deepened. His color returned. When the first thin blade of sunlight found its way into the cave, his eyes opened. He saw Emmeline, sitting beside him, her face lined with exhaustion, her honey blonde hair loose and tangled, her blue eyes rimmed with red from a night without sleep. She held a tin cup of warm water in one hand and his hand in the other. "You came," he said. His voice was a ruin. "I promised. You rode into the mountains, in winter, alone. Wyatt was with me, and I was not going to let you die in a cave because you were too stubborn to stay in town. He looked at her hand holding his, at the small, pale fingers wrapped around his scarred knuckles, the hands of a teacher's daughter from Philadelphia, the hands that had just saved his life. You are insane, he said, and you are alive. So perhaps my insanity has its uses. Something that might have been a smile crossed his battered face. The first smile in a very long time. They returned to Bear Creek 3 days later. Caleb rode though he swayed in the saddle. Josiah rode beside him, one arm in a sling made from Emmeline's shawl. Wyatt brought up the rear as always, watching the back trail with the vigilance of a man who had learned that Silas Crandall was not the kind of problem that stayed solved. And Emmeline rode at the front, leading. The town saw them come in, saw the bandages, saw the blood, saw the woman in the red dress riding ahead of 3 mountain men, her back straight, her chin lifted, her eyes clear. The whispers that Harlan Briggs had planted withered in the light of what people saw with their own eyes. This was not a swindler's bride. This was the woman who had ridden into the mountains alone to bring back the men who were building their livery, healing their children, protecting their town. Marshal Virgil Cole met them at the boarding house. His face was carved granite. In his hand was the letter Emmeline had written before she left, detailing the financial discrepancies in the town accounts, the connection between Briggs and Phineas Crane, and the accusation that Briggs had hired Silas Crandall to attack her wagon and later to ambush Caleb. I have been reading this, Cole said, and I have questions for Mayor Briggs. The confrontation happened 3 days later on a Sunday morning in front of the Caldwell boarding house. It happened on a Sunday because Emmeline wanted witnesses, and on Sunday the whole town gathered for church. It happened in front of the boarding house because that was where Briggs had first come to ask his careful questions about strong boxes, and Emmeline believed in a certain symmetry of justice. Briggs arrived with his usual confidence. Black vest, silk cravat, polished boots that had never known mud. He smiled at the crowd the way a man smiles at people he considers beneath him. I understand there are accusations, he said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a politician. Serious accusations from a woman who has been in our town less than a month, a stranger, the intended bride of a known criminal. Emmeline stepped forward. Caleb stood beside her, still bandaged, still pale from the mountain. But he did not speak. He did not need to. His presence said everything. She is not alone. Josiah flanked her left arm still in a sling. Wyatt flanked her right, both revolvers visible, his face set in an expression that promised consequences to anyone who interfered. Emmeline opened her notebook. Mayor Briggs, she said, and her voice carried across the gathered crowd like a bell. I can read numbers, and numbers do not lie. She read the figures, every overcharged invoice, every inflated price. Lumber sold to the town at 60% above wholesale, nails at twice the catalog rate, hardware marked up beyond any reasonable explanation. 3 years of consistent skimming totaling over $400. That is money that belonged to this town, Emmeline said. Your money, your neighbor's money, taken by the man who was supposed to protect your interests. Briggs's smile flickered. Those are administrative costs, the price of doing business on the frontier. I hardly think a girl from Philadelphia understands the economics of supply and demand in Wyoming. Then perhaps you can explain this. Emmeline produced a letter, the one found in the wreckage of her wagon, the one addressed to H.B. from Phineas Crane detailing our arrangement and the last shipment of ore. H.B. Emmeline said, Harlan Briggs. Phineas Crane was laundering stolen gold through his store in Oregon, and you, Mayor, were his partner. The crowd stirred. Murmurs ran through them like wind through dry grass. Briggs's composure cracked. That letter proves nothing. Anyone could have written those initials. Then explain one more thing. Emmeline's voice did not rise. It did not need to. When you visited me at the boarding house, you asked if Phineas Crane had sent a strongbox with me. The word you used was strongbox, the exact same word used by the man who attacked my wagon, the man with the burn scar, Silas Crandall, the man you later hired to ambush Caleb Hawthorne on the mountain. She paused. Let the silence do its work. I never mentioned a strongbox to anyone in Bitter Creek. There is only one way you could have known that word, Mayor. Crandall works for you, he always has. The murmurs became voices. The voices became a chorus. Old man Jensen, who had sold overpriced lumber on Briggs's orders, stepped forward with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground. She is right. Briggs told me what prices to charge. Said it was standard. I should have known better. Mrs. Dalrymple, the preacher's wife who had crossed the street to avoid Emmeline, pressed her hand to her mouth. Nettie Garrett held her baby tighter and looked at Emmeline with an expression that was equal parts shame and admiration. Briggs's face had gone the color of old candle wax. He looked from face to face, searching for an ally, finding none. The town that had feared him for years was looking at him now with new eyes. The eyes of people who have been lied to and have just discovered it. Marshal Cole stepped forward. His badge caught the winter sunlight. Harlan Briggs, I have questions, and you will answer them. We can do this here or in my office. Your choice, Bam. Briggs looked at Cole, looked at the crowd, looked at Emmeline, small and pale in her crimson dress, notebook in hand, standing between three Hawthorne brothers like something that had been planted in poor soil and grown anyway. His shoulder sagged. The performance was over. As Cole led him away, Emmeline spoke one final time. Her voice was quiet now, almost gentle. Thank you, Mayor Briggs. Thank you for showing me who you were before it was too late. Briggs flinched as if she had struck him, because the words were not angry, they were not vengeful. They were the words of a woman who had looked at cruelty and chosen grace, and that more than any accusation was the thing that would keep Harlan Briggs awake at night for the rest of his diminished life. As for Silas Crandall, Marshal Cole sent word along the telegraph line that same afternoon. Federal warrants, armed robbery, attempted murder, conspiracy. The name Crandall crackled across the wires from Bitter Creek to Cheyenne to Denver. He was found 3 months later in a boarding house in Laramie alone, thin as a fence rail, staring at a carved wooden bird he kept in his coat pocket. A bird his brother Billy had whittled from pine bark the summer before the war. He did not resist arrest. The men who took him said he looked tired, not angry, not dangerous, just tired. The way a man looks when he has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has finally set it down. He was sentenced to 12 years in the territorial prison. Whether he ever found peace is not a question I can answer. But I like to think the wooden bird helped. Sometimes the smallest things carry the most weight. Caleb watched the confrontation with Briggs happen, all of it. He watched this woman, this girl from Philadelphia with her green-covered novel and her father's notebook and her mother's locket dismantle the most powerful man in Bitter Creek with nothing but truth and arithmetic. And he understood with a clarity that felt like sunlight breaking through 9 years of cloud that he was not watching a woman who needed him. He was watching a woman who had chosen him, and that was worth more than anything he had ever built with his hands. That evening, after Cole led Briggs away and the crowd dispersed, and the town of Bitter Creek went quiet with the weight of what it had witnessed. Emmeline sat alone in her room at the boarding house. Baby Anna Hope slept in the applewood cradle. The fire crackled low, and for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Emmeline opened her mother's locket. She had carried it for 8 years without reading the note inside. Her mother, Catherine, had given it to her father on the night she died, and her father had pressed it into Emmeline's hand and said, "Your mother wanted you to have this. She said you would know when to open it." Emmeline had been waiting for the right moment. She had carried the locket through grief, through poverty, through 2,000 miles of prairie and mountain, through blood and blizzard and the death of her only friend. She had carried it because as long as it remained closed, there was still one gift her mother had not yet given her. One last word, one last embrace, and she had been saving it for the moment she needed it most. She opened the clasp. Inside was a small photograph of Catherine Whitmore, faded to sepia, her smile gentle and certain. And beneath the photograph, folded into a square no bigger than a postage stamp, a slip of paper in her mother's handwriting. "My dearest Emmeline, home is not a place. It is whoever makes you feel safe. Find your home, my darling, wherever the wind takes you." Emmeline read the words twice, 3 times, then she closed the locket and pressed it against her heart and looked out the window. In the yard below, Caleb Hawthorne was adding the last beam to the livery stable. Josiah handed him nails. Wyatt held the lantern. 3 brothers working by lamplight, building something that would stand. "I found it, Mama," Emmeline whispered. "I found home." Spring came to Wyoming the way it always does, slowly, then all at once. The snow retreated up the mountains. The creeks swelled with meltwater. The cottonwoods along the river bottom put out their first pale green buds, and the meadows filled with wildflowers so thick that a person could lie down and disappear in color. The wedding was held in the Bitter Creek Church on the first Sunday in April. Simple. No pomp. No imported dress or hired musicians. Emmeline wore her red dress, the same one she had arrived in, cleaned and mended by Mrs. Caldwell's steady hands. She wore it because it was the only dress she owned, and because Caleb had first seen her in it, bleeding and brave beside a broken wagon, and she wanted him to see her in it again. Not as a victim, as a bride. The church was full. Every family in Bitter Creek attended, and some from the ranches beyond. Mrs. Caldwell sat in the front pew and wept openly, which stunned everyone who had ever met her, because Agnes Caldwell was not a woman who wept. Nettie Garrett held baby Anna Hope, who wore a bonnet sewn from a scrap of Emmeline's shawl, and babbled happily through the entire ceremony. Josiah stood as best man, his arm finally free of its sling, his gentle face beaming. Wyatt stood beside him, scrubbed clean for the first time anyone could remember. His hair actually combed. His expression caught somewhere between fierce pride and the very real terror of a man who has been asked to hold a ring and is not confident he will not drop it. The preacher read the vows. Caleb spoke his. "I do not have much," he said, and his deep voice filled the small church the way water fills a cup. "A livery stable, a cabin I have not finished building, and 2 brothers who never know when to be quiet." Josiah smiled. Wyatt did not deny it. "But I have a promise. Winter always ends, and what you build in the cold that lasts forever. I will build with you, Emmeline, every day, for as long as God gives us." Emmeline took his hand, the same hand that had delivered Anna Hope into the world, the same hand that had trembled when it brushed her hair from her face on a moonlit porch, the same hand she had held through a night of fever in a mountain cave. "I came west with nothing," she said, "a carpet bag and a letter from a dead man and a book my mother loved. I did not come looking for you, Caleb Hawthorne, but I found you and you found me, and that is enough for any lifetime." He kissed her then, gently. The way a man kisses something he has been afraid to touch for 9 years, something fragile and precious that turned out to be stronger than he was. The church erupted, not in polite applause, in whoops, in boot stomping, in the kind of noise that frontier people make when they witness something real. 5 years passed. Now I want you to see this clearly because this is the part of the story I hold closest. Bitter Creek grew. The rail spur expanded. New families came. The livery stable that Caleb Hawthorne built with his own hands became the largest in the territory known for horses that were gentled rather than broken because Caleb understood something about trust that most harrismen never learned. Josiah married Nettie Garrett in the autumn of that first year and became the closest thing Bitter Creek had to a doctor delivering babies and setting bones and brewing the yarrow teas that old Doc Morrison had taught him in a Cheyenne rail station a lifetime ago. Wyatt never married. He claimed he was too ornery and nobody argued. But every morning before the sun cleared the mountains, Wyatt Hawthorne saddled a small spotted pony and lifted a 5-year-old girl named Anna Hope onto its back and led her along the creek trail, pointing out wildflowers by name. Columbine, Indian paintbrush, fireweed, lupine. She memorized them all. She called him Uncle Y, and she was the only person on earth who could make Wyatt Hawthorne smile without trying. Emmeline opened a proper school, 20 students the first year, 30 the second. Parents rode from ranches half a day away to bring their children because word had spread that the teacher in Bitter Creek did not just teach reading and arithmetic. She taught children to think, to question, to look at a column of numbers or a page of words and find the truth hiding inside. Mrs. Caldwell became the acting mayor after Briggs's removal. Nobody ran against her. Nobody dared. And Caleb Hawthorne, who had ridden west 9 years ago, because he could not bear to hear his dead wife's voice anymore, sat on the porch of the cabin he had built with his own hands, every plank, every nail, every shingle, and watched the sun go down over the Wyoming mountains. His knees popped when he stood up. He still did not comment on it. But now, when the sound came, a small hand tugged at his trouser leg. "Papa, Mama says supper is ready." Anna Hope, 5 years old, dark hair like Retta, eyes that were beginning to settle into a deep warm brown, a smile so wide and so frequent that it seemed impossible she had been born in a snowstorm beside a dead mule to a mother who would not live to see the dawn. Caleb lifted her. She was heavier now than she had been that night, but she was still light in his arms. Light the way children are light when you love them so much it makes the muscles in your chest ache. He carried her inside. The cabin smelled of stew and fresh bread and the dried sage that Emmeline hung above the stove because Josiah told her it kept the air clean. Books lined every wall. Not one bookshelf now, but 7 built over 5 years, each one a little finer than the last because Caleb discovered that he liked building things for a woman who filled them. Emmeline stood at the stove, her honey blonde hair braided and pinned, her face flushed from the heat, wearing an apron over a blue calico dress that Mrs. Caldwell had sewn for her birthday. She was 27 now, still small, still fierce, still capable of looking a man in the eye and telling him exactly what she thought, whether he wanted to hear it or not. She looked up when Caleb came through the door. Blue eyes met Amber the same way they had met that first evening beside a broken wagon in a creek bed when she had pointed a knife no bigger than a finger at his chest and said, "Stay back." Now she said, "Wash your hands, both of you." Anna Hope giggled. Caleb set her down and she ran to the basin, splashing water everywhere. And Emmeline sighed the sigh of a mother who has accepted that her floor will never be dry. Outside the window, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, soft, quiet, covering the world in white. Winter always ends, Emmeline said, watching the flakes drift past the glass. Caleb stood behind her, close, not touching, but close enough that his warmth reached her. But what you build in the cold, he said. And from the table where Anna Hope sat with the spoon already in her fist and a grin on her face that contained every ounce of stubbornness inherited from a mother she would never know and a mother she would never forget, came a voice bright as morning, lasts forever and ever. Caleb and Emmeline looked at each other, and they laughed, together, in a cabin full of books and bread and firelight on the edge of a Wyoming winter with a child between them who existed because a cowboy heard a woman screaming across empty plains and chose not to ride away. They called it a joke. Remember Harlan Briggs and his gold-capped smile and his soft politician's hands? He thought he was sending a girl to her death. He thought the wilderness would swallow her. He thought the stone he threw away was worthless. But the stone was a diamond, and the men who found her were not cowboys or drifters or mountain hermits. They were builders, three brothers who had spent 9 years hiding from the world and one autumn learning that the world was worth coming back to. Two broken people, three stubborn brothers, and one baby girl. That was enough to build a whole world. Until next time, friends, keep your fire burning bright. And next week I have a story for you about a man who found a lantern glowing in a cabin window he thought had been dark for 10 years. The woman inside was not supposed to be there, but she was, and his life was never the same again. Until then, go in peace.